In chapter 16 of Genesis, Parshat Lech Lecha, we find a narration of Sarah suggesting to Abraham, or at that time Avram, to take their maidservant for a wife, and so that since they were childless, she would at least be able to bear a child for Abraham. And that's what happened. And the woman that he married was Hagar, and she gave birth to Ishmael. And the Torah tells us in chapter 16, verse 16, and Abram was 86 years old when he gave birth to Ishmael. Of what significance is it to us how old Avram was when he gave birth? I mean, obviously he wasn't a young man. And when he gave birth at age 86, obviously he was still strong enough to have a boy, who was Ishmael. And then immediately on to 17, it says when Avram was then 99 years old, 13 years later, there is a change of Avram in verse 5 of chapter 17, and it says, neither shall thy name any more be called Avram, but thy name shall be Avraham. And there was the addition of the hey inserted into his name. And when this happened, it says in verse 11, and you shall be circumcised in the flesh of your foreskin, and it shall be a covenant between me and you. And that was when Abraham was 99. And in verse 12 it says, and be it that a child that is 8 days old shall be circumcised amongst you. It does not say, or for whatever reason, that Abraham was not circumcised when he was 8 days old. And in fact, it appears that the time for this covenant, which is the way circumcision is referred to, would take place when he was 99 years old. And then the precept, according to all commentators, the precept of in the 8th day for all generations shall be when the circumcision shall take place. And there we have the beginning of this new precept, one of the 613 precepts concerning circumcision. Now, of course, in our minds, we're going to raise the question, why circumcision in the first place? Why does circumcision have to be considered the covenant, the brit, between the Lord and Abraham, and subsequently all of Israel? And it also mentions that he circumcised his son Ishmael, and he of course was 13, since Abraham was 86 when he gave birth to Ishmael, and when he was 99 he circumcised himself and Ishmael. Consequently, Ishmael was 13, and it is even to this very day that all descendants of Ishmael, namely the Arabs, circumcised at age 13. And there we have the mention of circumcision. Another point that I would like to mention before we delve into the importance of circumcision and where it says in chapter 17, verse 23, and Abraham circumcised the entire household, the flesh of their foreskin, in that day. Now, which day was it? It wasn't the 8th day. It wasn't his 8th day. But there is no reason not to believe that this might have taken place 8 days later after Abraham had received the precept. So there we have another indication that the circumcision must take place be'etzem hayom hazeh, in that day, meaning the 8th day, not before the 8th day. Now, why not before the 8th day? We also know that if a circumcision takes place before the 8th day, it is completely invalid, and another shall I say, aspect of the brit must then again be performed. Obviously, the foreskin has been removed, but it is something which is known as hatafet dam brit, meaning the drawing of a little blood, which is done again by a mohel, the one who performs, or one who's knowledgeable in the performance of circumcision. Because prior to the 8th day, it is considered to be totally invalid. And of course, we raise the question as to why. Now we turn to a seemingly unrelated story that happens in Exodus. In Exodus. Some of you may be familiar with the story when Moses was told to go down to Egypt after he had fled, and he was told to go back to Egypt, and he took his wife, Zipporah, and his 2 children, and on the way, they had stopped off at a hotel. Just trying to quote the exact verse. They stopped off at a motel, Malon, and it seems, and we have no prior indication, that one of the sons of Moses was not circumcised. And at that point, for the moment, I thought it was in Exodus itself, in Shemot. And at that point, the angel of death was going to take the life of Moses, and Zipporah took a stone, cut off the foreskin, and thus removing the Satan, removing the angel of death from Moses. And there too, we can raise many questions. Didn't Moses know about the precept of circumcision? And why did it all happen the way it did? That here he stops at a hotel, and there the angel of death meets with him. Why couldn't it be before? Why couldn't it be later? Why at that particular point? And but somehow it's another narration relating to the precept of circumcision. And for the moment, I don't know. Is there anybody here who remembers offhand? Yeah.
It's not Shemot?
Yes, in Shemot.
No, in the beginning, in Shemot.
No, it's twice the name.
It's in the second
What?
part. It's in the second part.
Well, it's when he comes back. It's when he comes back to. I saw it just before in the Hebrew edition. I found it for whatever reason. It eludes me, and maybe the page is missing. That's a possibility. All right, and it's in chapter 4, verse 24. It's such an insignificant aspect, but there it is. And it came to pass on the way at the lodging place that the Lord met him and sought to kill him. The Lord met him. Doesn't say an angel of death. And it says that Zipporah took a flint and cut off the foreskin of her son and cast it at his feet. Cast the foreskin at his feet.
Moses? And the child. The child, right?
It doesn't say. It doesn't say. But Rashi says at the foot of Moses. At the foot of Moses. And she said, and if we take I'm going to quote for you the literal expression, and I guess you'll all be a little taken aback, but I'm quoting, "Surely a bridegroom of blood art thou to me." And then she said, so he let him alone. And then she said, a bridegroom of blood in regard of the circumcision. This is the description of what happened. And it's quite coded, as you can understand, because from its literal translation, what does it mean here, bridegroom, and so forth and so on. All right? To begin our exploration into this mitzvah, and when we discuss a mitzvah, we know that its purpose is not, again, biblical doctrine. It is not purely and merely for the sake of God thrusting another precept upon us, as if we haven't got enough. And I will quote, and we will begin with the Zohar, with the reading of the Zohar, because this will provide us with a greater perception, a greater awareness, and even an elevated consciousness, merely by reading the Zohar, to permit us to understand more fully the implication of Brit. I quote in the Zohar, Parshat Lech Lecha, which deals with Brit Milah. As long as Israel upholds this particular covenant, the world is balanced. And when Israel does not uphold or cancels or does not consider the Brit important, then Brit Shemai Veretz Eino Mitkayimim, then the balance of the world no longer exists, Ubrachot Einam Nimsaot Ba'olam, and blessings no longer are to be found in the world. And continues the Zohar, Bo'orei Lo Shaltu Amim Acherim Al Yisrael Ela Kasher Bitlu Mehem Brit Hazeh. Zohar even goes much further than that to say that the other nations of the world that despise Israel, its enemies, could never have dominion over Jews only and when they no longer upheld the covenant, the mitzvah and precept of Brit. Because there is another aspect to the cutting of the foreskin. And unfortunately, this is so much ignorance surrounds this particular aspect that I must say that for whatever reason, the aspect of priya, which means the tearing of the membrane, and many of you may not even be familiar with that. If the membrane is not torn asunder, v'lo nigale basar kadosh, and because of that, I'm just translating, because that was not done at the time of the Brit, all of the nations shall rule over Israel. Because, as it says, as Elijah the prophet said, Vayazvu et Hashem, because they have forsaken, they have left Hashem. Ki al yedei hapriya mitgalim otiot Hashem yudhei. Because when that priya takes place, then the power of the letters, the Yud K of the Tetragrammaton, is revealed. And therefore the Hebrew word priya, otiot para Yud Hey. When you tear asunder, in other words, this, the Hebrew word for tearing asunder the membrane, and I'll shortly give you a more detailed description of what we're talking about, then the Yud K is revealed. However, Kemin shelo paru lo nigala alem Hashem Yud K. And that means Sha'azvu Hashem Yud K. There are many other precepts, more important precepts you might say, and yet nowhere does the Zohar ever make a comment that when this does not occur during the circumcision, that the non-Jew, when I say the non-Jew, I don't mean the non-Jew, I mean those who are created for the specific purpose of putting the Jew in place, that they can have no dominion as long as this aspect of priya occurs. It does not say this insofar as any other precept is concerned. It only is involved with this aspect of priya, the aspect of circumcision and priya. And here the Zohar makes mention of the other aspect of Moses, when we discuss Vahi b'derech b'malon, when he was in the hotel, Vayivkesheo Hashem vayavekesh amito. And what was the problem, says the Zohar? Because when God spoke to Moses, he says, how could you go, Holech lotzi et Yisrael Mitzrayim, and create a dominion over Paro, and you are nullifying or canceling this particular mitzvah? For your son is not circumcised. Miyad vayevakesh hamito. And he wanted to kill him. And here he goes on to say why that was happening. That it's a lengthy discussion. But he also ties it in. He ties it in with this aspect of Brit Milah. In other words, and that's the purpose of the Zohar bringing the aspect of Moshe and his son, to indicate that God said you could never create a dominion over Pharaoh. You could never initiate an exodus from Egypt as long as your son was not circumcised. So the purpose of the Zohar bringing in Moses at this time is to make it clear that Moses could never create a dominion over Egypt, destroy the aspect of what Egypt represented until the Brit was accomplished in his own son. And when Sipporah accomplished that aspect, he then could go on and do what he did.